And we never celebrated our birthdays with parties. He would just take a big pot of biryani and we would go, and it was the thatch roof, mud floor, and sit with them, share a meal. And he always said, if you had a special day, you shouldn't share that with the rich and the privileged, but these are the beloved of God. Although I have to say, he didn't believe in institutional religion.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Okay, good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest, which is really a special, super special guest. We know each other from way back when I started my career, working on migrant issues and HIV/AIDS. Sharuna, please introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me on your show. I didn't think that we would be meeting, on a platform like this and talking about things other than work, but it's nice. So I'm here in Malaysia now, but I'm a migrant spouse. I was born in India, and I come from a family where social activism and social justice has been like a tradition for a few generations. And growing up also, my father had a very strong influence on my life. I lost him when I was 16, but in our early years, my sister and I, he would take us for walks on Sundays, holding our hands on either side, and he would take us through the slums and the poorer areas. And that sensitization, I think, to poverty, to the poor, that concern, and he himself was involved in developing a rehabilitation center for people who had leprosy. And we never celebrated our birthdays with parties. He would just take a big pot of biryani and we would go, and it was the thatch roof, mud floor, and sit with them, share a meal. And he always said, if you had a special day, you shouldn't share that with the rich and the privileged, but these are the beloved of God. Although I have to say, he didn't believe in institutional religion, but I think he also showed me that path. I remember when I was about 10 years old, he sat me down and he said, you can do whatever you like with your life, whichever religion, marry whoever you want. Just don't come crying to me once you've made your decision. And he also said, I will just show you what I believe and what I practice. So even though he was kind of vehemently opposed to institutionalized religion, I also saw faith, and I saw that living out of that in the concern for the poor. And so I think in my own adult life, a defining moment of my life was, when I experienced God through a crisis which emerged, from his passing, and searching for the meaning of life, of what is the truth and all of that. So that was one major influence. On my mother's side, actually, for 3 generations, women have been very socially active. And that was something that was also reinforced in my family and home. So that was also something that, I grew up with that strong sense of identity, that as a woman, I could do things, I could achieve like any man, which was not very common in those days, growing up. So these were, I think, some of the major influences in my life, which, went on to be enduring in terms of defining the things that I would do later in life.
And you were telling about your sister. You had more siblings, or
So we're just two of us. She's
Okay.
2 years younger.
Yeah.
She still lives in India. She takes care of my mom.
Okay.
And my mom lives with her. We're a
Mhm.
close, yeah, small family.
Yeah. So so there was an enormous influence of your dad, and then also in some way of your mom. So then, how did you come about to choose the study that you ultimately decided to do, and where did you do that?
Right. So actually, to tell you the truth, my first choice was interior designing, and I was not allowed to do it because there was no degree in those days, and my family felt that I wouldn't be financially stable if I just had a diploma. I wanted to do literature, but that also they felt was not, it wouldn't provide me a stable income. So I kind of drifted into economics. In that sense, I think that was more my father's choice than mine, and he was in business and all of that. But when I did my MPhil, my thesis was on the growth and structure of the pharmaceutical industry in Hyderabad, which is my hometown. And you may know that it's the pharmaceutical capital of the country. And in the process of doing the study, I also got exposed to all the irregularities and all the, things that were happening in the industry. And I, at that point, wanted to make a shift to public health, but I just couldn't because, I had to be financially independent. And so I continued with my PhD. I did 2 years, and then my husband and I were, kind of youth leaders in the, youth movement. And our, decision to marry was actually to serve the poor together. He was a medical doctor at that time. And when I came to Malaysia after marrying him, I thought I would transfer universities and finish off my PhD. But unfortunately, the laws at that time, they did not allow foreign spouses to work or to study.
Mm,
So my professional life went into a long hiatus in a way. But after about a couple of months, I bumped into Irene Fernandez, whom you know.
yeah,
And so her organization, Tenaganita, was doing this research with the Free University of Amsterdam with Ivan. And they were doing this 1 year study, which was exploring the vulnerability of migrant workers in Malaysia to HIV. And they were looking for someone actually to coordinate that study. So she asked if I would, help them. And so I started off as a volunteer because, I really wanted to do something useful and
yeah,
meaningful with my life. And, you may know some of this history, Maurice. We use the participatory action research methodology. And in the process of doing the research on HIV, we were also getting these stories about migrant workers who were in detention centers. And long story short, the organization sent the government a memorandum on what was happening in the detention centers. And it ended up with the executive director, which is, Irene, being charged under the Printing Presses and Publications Act. And it went on to, become one of the longest running trials in the country. Went on for 13 years. And although the, rules around spouses had relaxed, I was quite involved in the case in terms of the migrants, and also under there were I had to go also for investigations because they wanted names of those who had given the information, migrant workers and all of
yeah,
that. So, and then of course that 1 year study, it became a regional network. And so I grew with that and went on to coordinate the regional network, set up the regional secretariat in KL, and the rest is history.
yeah,
So yeah, that's a very
mhm,
unconventional path. And
yeah,
after about 25 years, so then when I at one point of time, I think about 12 and a half, 13 years, I was a little tired of what I was doing also in
hmm,
CARAM because things were not changing on the ground.
yeah,
And I was bitten by the bug to do, what my partners were doing in the countries, which was about the implementation of the science on the ground,
mhm,
but also to do it in a way that infused the principles and the methods of the right to health. And that was the time that Paul Hunt had just become, the UN Special Rapporteur on Health, and he was defining what was the contours of the right to health and all of that. And so I decided to go back to school to finish my PhD. And, out of the blue, I was also offered a job and to teach in the medical school. And I realized that all the years that, I wondered if actually I started with an early career in academics in India. And it was very intentional when I started that. But when I veered off the track and I came back again, I realized that there was a purpose to that detour because my ability to teach what I do now, comes from that road less traveled, which I took, in terms especially of understanding the deep-rooted systemic injustices in health systems and how structural barriers, impede people's ability to just enjoy good health.
Just for the listeners, you mentioned Ivan. So Ivan Wolfers is my brother-in-law, and he passed away, unfortunately, after a long, struggle with cancer. Irene Fernandez, who you mentioned, who was in that court case for so long, ultimately got also the alternative Nobel Prize, right, for peace.
Yes, that's right.
So pretty remarkable people that we have both had the privilege of working with and knowing. Can you say in short, in terms of the work that you did with CARAM, this network of organizations working on mobility, migration, and AIDS, how was that of influence? Because I understand, when you're upbringing, your father, your parents were important, but this seems to be also an important part. Can you tell a bit about
Yeah,
that?
sure, absolutely. And I think, Ivan was a major, figure in that whole space. And, he was also like a great mentor. Um, I think his vision of democratizing science, as he used to say, and the way that he chose to do it in ways that were unconventional and yet trying to do it in a scientific way. So looking at evidence-based, approaches to developing these health interventions in different countries, but bottom up, really pushing for ways in which the affected communities were part of defining the problem, owning the, interventions and part of it. And that was really something that, had an enduring impact, I think, on my life. And even today, my academic career and the research I do is very strongly influenced by that formation that I had in CARAM. I think also seeing the bigger picture, sometimes when you work on the ground, you tend to, become quite inward looking. But CARAM gave me that perspective of balancing, the macro, meso, micro, and the importance also of engaging with multiple stakeholders. These are very complex problems, and there are no straight black and white answers. And it's both a science and an art, it's how we understand the context, how we navigate structures, institutions. So I think it was deeply, it contributed tremendously to my growth as a practitioner, but has also enriched my perspectives, which today, give me that keen and deep insight, even as an educator and as a researcher.
Yeah, can we make a jump to what you are doing today? And then also tell a bit about, because I know what you do is also affected, but what's going on, in the world today in terms of, the country that I live in at the moment. with the new administration that came out with a lot of executive orders. Yeah, tell us.
So a couple of things. One is, my husband is a psychiatrist, and he and I
Mm,
have Xavier. He and I have co-founded this organization called Health Equity
mhm,
Initiatives, and our grassroots work is around mental health of refugees and asylum seekers. And we started off with no funding, nothing. Basically talking to refugee communities to ask them what might be of use to them, and they suggested a training on mental health. So Xavier developed this 9-month competency based training. He's also a medical educator. um, and at the end of that 9-month training, the the participants began to go out into the community, and we still had no money, but they were employed by UNHCR, many of them. So we kind of came to an understanding with UNHCR that we would borrow them for a few days and go out into the community to support them. And as we started doing that, then referrals started coming in. So we actually incrementally built every component of the program. Then we set up the clinical services. Then in the clinical services, we found that it was, just the arrest and detention, the house, the rental, the employment issues. These were all precipitating their mental health problems. So we set up case management services, and then it was treatment adherence support, and then it was support groups for, women who were recovering and to keep them in remission and to create those social connections. So different components of the program and the organization began with that, an internship for medical students on health and human rights. So that's one hat, which is health equity initiatives. But today we have an independent team, and my role is mainly in terms of working with the leadership of the organization, because they are all very capable, and they're able to do what they do. I'm also teaching in the School of Medicine in Monash University, Malaysia. I teach an interdisciplinary unit which is around focused on health equity, health systems, and the broader context, in which disease and health are produced. And I am also part of a coalition called the People's Health Forum, where we work on health reform and for health to be recognized as a right, and not just based on the ability to pay. That's a
It,
nutshell.
as always, extremely busy. Um, and those organizations have websites, and so that people can check it out.
Yeah,
Is that
so
possible?
it's
You provide, so I can, yeah, mention it.
that's www.healthequityinitiatives.org.
Okay. And I will also make sure that I put it in the podcast notes so that people can check it out. But tell me that basically the challenge at the moment is that part of your funding is stopped at the moment,
Yeah,
right?
because a large part of our funding is from the US Department of
Mm-hmm.
State, and with the new, the executive order, there has been a sudden freeze of
Mm-hmm.
funding, and which means that, critical services to refugees, a quarter of our patients, have very severe, like, mental health problems like chronic PTSD,
Mm-hmm.
major depression, comorbidity of different disorders. So that's one. But, also our funding is quite modest. And so salaries are not, all that high.
Mm-hmm.
And when you suddenly lay off, you have to lay off workers, then it's also, they are in an untenable situation. So there has been no time for planning the transition. And it's just a time of deep crisis. But we just hope that this new emergency humanitarian waiver to the foreign assistance pause, that'll bring some kind of at least relief to yeah, to this problem.
Yeah. And while we are at the moment we are recording this episode, yeah, a couple of days ago, Rubio mentioned about a waiver, and so a possibility for at least some of the projects that deal with emergency situations, life-threatening situations, that they could continue. And unfortunately, it's almost every day there is something else going on. So at the moment, people will listen to this episode. The situation might have changed, hopefully
Yeah.
for the better, so that you can continue this important work. And Sharuna, tell me that, because basically for migrants in Malaysia, it's always been there has been tension in terms of the rights that they have, um, yeah, problems around being documented and not. I mean, that started already when you were working for CARAM, right? When that particular project identified that while building the two twin towers, how were they
Yeah.
called? Um, that a lot was going on, um, jeopardizing the rights of the workers, and that's why the report came, and that's why Karam ultimately got into trouble, because the government didn't like what you wrote. So how is that then for you at the moment, working on these migrant issues, where you are also dealing with undocumented migrants?
So refugees are considered undocumented
Mm-hmm,
because we have not ratified the Refugee Convention.
mm-hmm,
But it's a very, you could say, liminal limbo kind of state that they inhabit.
mm-hmm,
So while on the one hand, the immigration law doesn't recognize their status legally, the Ministry of Health gives a 50% discount off foreigners' rates
mm,
for refugees and asylum seekers. And they are at the risk of arrest, detention, deportation, but in practice, they are also let off after documents are checked and, if they find that they
mm-hmm,
have the UNHCR cards.
mm,
So, while some may think that they do have some kind of an advantage because of this kind of, these discretionary practices, actually the uncertainty is, it's quite challenging for the refugee because you're between states. You're neither,
mm-hmm,
documented, undocumented, and you could be at any time subject to these different policies and measures. So there's tremendous stress, and then there's also extortion from locals. And right now, there are a lot of raids and arrests that are going on for undocumented workers, which are also impacting refugees and migrants. And because they already have a past experience of trauma, this exacerbates, especially those with mental health problems. It exacerbates the fear, the panic, the symptoms. So it's a very difficult, and then the children, can't join government schools.
mm-hmm,
So they join these alternative learning centers, which are set up by NGOs and by other refugee organizations. They're also legally not allowed to work. So they end up doing, working in the informal sector in the typical 3D jobs, and which means, you're subject to exploitation, to those kinds of problems. You don't have protection. But I must say that they do show a lot of resilience in the way they organize themselves, in the way they help each other. But there's also that limit to what they can do and to that resilience that is in their communities, because structurally, they have all these barriers to navigate and to deal with.
mm. So because when I listened to you carefully, one of the reasons that ultimately you moved on from the work that you did for Karam, the network working on AIDS and migration, because you felt, oh, we are not making progress. Um,
Yeah.
so how is that in your present work then? Are you you know?
I think it's the same. I mean, I'm
Mm,
also engaged in migrant labor and health
yeah.
around, yeah, with migrant labor, and that's not refugees. But so things have not really changed on the ground, I
Hmm.
think, in terms of policy. And I think that's the world over. You
Hmm.
know, it's getting quite stringent in terms of what they're able, the protections that they have. But I get the satisfaction that at least on the ground, I'm able to have some impact,
Mm,
and to be able to bring, that kind of healing and hope.
mm,
So it's a little different from, only doing advocacy to continuing to do that. It's not that I've given up on,
mhm,
advocacy. It's just that I'm also, I think this was also, a struggle that for years, because of the exposure to activists who came from a different generation, and, from this whole human rights orientation, where you think that, services is something that's not empowering. It's only conscientizing, mobilizing,
mm,
advocating, that's empowering. I've also come to see, like the Maslow hierarchy of needs. For
mm,
example, you have to have your basic needs met before you can,
mm,
go and do all that. I once did a training after doing all that, a course with Paul Hunt and the others in the University of Utrecht. I did a training with refugee leaders on monitoring the right to health. And at the end of it, they asked me, what use is this? Because these rights are mediated through citizenship rights, domestically in the country. And so, what can we really do with this at the end of it? So, yeah,
mm.
actually providing the services helps to build them in different ways. Yeah.
Okay. Let us allow me to make a jump in terms of, because what you're touching upon is, maybe a vision, how things should go, theories, policy levels, global, and then, that at the end, what you were saying also, but also for yourself, then it's good to see why that work at the policy levels is also important, because you still have a linkage with the ground, right? With the field, quote unquote. Um, Going to the policy level, the world, after they had created the Millennium Development Goals, a process was created that was more inputs, and ultimately the Sustainable Development Goals were developed, 17 goals that should ultimately make our world more sustainable, more just. I don't think well, I think it's far from perfect, but it's what we have. Um, so, but what I've noticed is that not all people know about it. So I have a question always about my guest is, what do you want to know? What do you want the listeners to know about the Sustainable Development Goals? And yeah, they need to be reached before 2030, and we are all only at 15 to 17%. So yeah, tell us a bit how you look at those SDGs.
I think they offer a, great framework for global progress. But what I see is that the commitment to achieving them is deeply unequal.
Mm,
Um, my engagement is more around health. So
yeah.
it's, goal 3 of health and well-being. And health, we know, is so foundational. It's what shapes our opportunities to livelihoods, to education, to
Mm,
overall well-being, not just for individuals, but, also whole communities. And you and I have seen in our work, the kind of disparities that exist and how deep rooted and complex they are. But, as much as the SDGs offer this kind of a very good framework for, global cooperation and for progress, I'm actually quite disappointed in its enforcement and, in the practice. I see, some people tirelessly working to achieve these goals. And Maurice, perhaps you're one of those.
mm,
But, there are also those for whom it seems like a branding exercise, a box to tick off, grand statements. Then you also see how it is used as a kind of a political tool, rather than genuine commitment to change. And I think we haven't learned from the failure of the MDGs. that, if we don't walk the talk, and if our commitments are not leading to, sustained practical action, then this will also become another unfulfilled promise. It looks good on paper. It sounds grand when talk about it, but it will not deliver the impact on the people who need it the most. So I'm not against it. I don't think that's what I'm saying either. I continue to
Understood.
strive
Yeah.
towards these goals with those who are believing. It's just that I'm not so enthusiastic about the uneven response
Yeah. Yeah.
to this.
And I
Yeah.
don't disagree with you about that. I mean, if you walk around in the US, you ask the people, most people will not know. Of course, that also has to do with the commitment from the government itself. But if you walk around in Kenya, a lot of people will know. So it definitely depends on the commitment. Now, there is this growing group of people around the world that are saying, one of the reasons that we are behind of reaching those SDGs is because we did not, or we are not paying proper attention to the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you need as an individual and as a community. Because, SDGs is about processes and system changes that requires, working on skills like empathy and critical thinking. So the inner development goals were formed as a result of that. 5 goals they identified: being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. My question to my guest is always: have you heard about those inner development goals? And if not, or if yes, any thoughts, immediate thoughts about when you hear this?
Actually, until you mentioned it, I had not heard of it, to tell you the truth.
Hmm.
And I kind of went and looked it up. And that was the first time, really, that I heard about these inner development goals. The one on resilience actually kind of resonates most with me, because I also see this a lot in the communities that I work with. That despite the unimaginable, suffering and the hardship, that they continue to do what they do. But what I also see in those who show this tremendous resilience is actually the meaning that they make out of these experiences. This I've seen in the lives of the refugees I'm working with, and it's the sense of gratitude, that deep sense of shared humanity, that they continue to serve their own community members, although they are experiencing hardship themselves, that deep love for family, for kin. Um, so even while they're living in this very, incredibly challenging circumstances, these values help them, to make a different kind of meaning of their experiences, and they are able to take others forward with them. They're able to move forward. But I think it's not about skills, Maurice, and that's the problem, because many of us today, we think that it's about acquiring these tips and tricks and techniques and somehow infusing them. But I think if we look the world over, there's a crisis of leadership. In terms of what we need is value-based leadership, and that's really missing at this point of time. And we can have any goals, we can have different frameworks. I mean, even if you look at the universal health coverage, we talk about access with financial protection, but nobody talks about what is the normative framework, what are the normative values that are required for that kind of an equitable financial protection. And so you have a hybrid of different kinds of health systems, which are basically just leaving the poor and those who really need it most, they're leaving them behind. So it's a crisis of values, and that's something we need to deeply reflect on and, work on.
I would like, no, thank you for that. I would like to jump back actually when you started, when talking about your dad. Um, you know, of what I heard is definitely you had a dad that was driven by very strong values and right and wrong and how you take care of each other. You also mentioned that he was not a religious person.
I kind of heard that you are that more the institutionalized faith is important to you. And actually, what is interesting, Sharuna, that this podcast is a spin-off of my 100-mile walk that I started in 2012. And yeah, when I walk, and especially after mile 5 to 10, when your knees start and your feet start to hurt, you ask yourself the question, why am I doing this? What is the purpose of life? So very often we talk about religion and spirituality. And what I'm really interested in is to hear from my guests is, what do you see happening among the youth in your community? Because in some places where I've been, it seems that the younger generation, looks differently at religion. They might be spiritual, they say, but they are not religious, and though it depends if and maybe certain continents it's different. Anyway, my question to you is, what do you see happening among in your community among youths, and of the role with regard to the role of religion and spirituality?
I think our communities and societies are quite diverse.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, I see multiple expressions. There are many who are indeed disillusioned with institutional religion. And I don't know whether, my perception that is probably quite a lot in Christianity, quite predominant, that people are walking away from the church, and probably also with good reason, the scandals of, sexual abuse, the disillusionment with the clergy. I think also the horrific and inhumane treatment of indigenous people and children. Many have been very deeply hurt by institutionalized religion, and they are walking away. So you see that that's one trend. But I think the world over, we are also seeing a lot of young people across different religions. They are coming back. There's a revival of faith, and they're actually returning to that kind of institutionalized religion. And I find, interestingly, in some cases, they probably hold, more orthodox views than their parents' generation. There's also a cohort of them. And of course, there are others who, who explore spirituality outside of the traditional religious structures in terms of mindfulness, engaging with nature, community, social activism, and all of that. But I think the bottom line is that despite the tremendous progress, in terms of technology and all of that, people are realizing that material progress doesn't bring about that kind of, inner peace, and there is a hunger for something deeper, and how to say, the kind of making those harmonious connections with oneself, with others, with the world. Yeah.
Is there a longing for community?
I think definitely connection is one of them,
Mm.
because although we seem to be very connected, actually we are very socially fragmented.
Mm-hmm. Um, well, piggybacking on the word connection that you used, what I hope this podcast achieves is that people are getting connected. We are connected, reconnected again, connection with my listeners. I have come up with a question that connects you with the previous guest, and the previous guest has a question for you.
Oh, what's your intention for the year to come? What's the one thing that you can strive every day to do? Whether you make it 10% or 110%. What is it that you're going to strive to do to make you better?
I think my intention this year is to slow down on striving. I've worked very hard all my life, and even at the cost of, my health, personal comfort, time. But I'm beginning to realize that to continue to be generative and to be life-giving to others, I have to also take care of myself. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that, because I've already made commitments. But I think beyond what I've already made, I'm going to be quite discerning in terms of how I align, future commitments with my purpose and also my own well-being. So yeah, it's probably less striving.
Okay. Your question for the next guest.
My question for the next guest would be, at the end of your life, what would matter most to you? What is the legacy that you would like to leave behind?
Okay. Yes, Sharuna, I don't know about you, but music is very important to me. So I always ask a question about music as well. I mean, some of the most guests actually find this the most difficult question I ask. But if you had to choose a song or a piece of music that best represents, at least for a big part, who you are, what you are about, which song or piece of music would that be, and why?
Actually, I don't really have a particular song. To tell you the truth, I don't have a lot of time to listen to music, but there are some songs that resonate deeply, and I go through seasons of listening, to one song all the time on loop. And one of the songs that I like to listen to quite often, it's a hymn actually called It Is Well With My Soul. And it's a powerful song. It was written by a man who lost his children in a shipwreck, and he continued to face tremendous adversity. I think his house got burnt down, he lost his business, all of that. And although, my own suffering is nowhere near those of the refugees I work with, I have also endured what I call, long seasons of just barren waiting, of loss, of separation, of hardship, especially since losing my father at 16. But, through it all, I've been very blessed to experience, what I call the ocean's depth in my relationship with God. So it's like the ocean. On the
Mm.
surface, you may have these waves that are turbulent and, crashing, but deep in the ocean's bed, in the bosom of my Father, God, there's just a sublime peace and a stillness. And I know how deeply loved I am, how I'm cherished, and He carries me through these crises and challenges.
Mm.
So this song actually resonates with me because it's
And
something like, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, you
mm.
have taught me to say it as well with my soul.
Yeah, and any message for the listeners or an invitation or a question?
I think, you have been talking a lot about kindness.
Mm.
And I think that's so important. It's just doing small acts of kindness, or even just the small things we do with extraordinary love and kindness, that's, I think, incredibly important. When I look around, I find that there's so much of contradiction within us. Of course, we are human, um, on the one hand, we are all about equity, inclusion, diversity, all of that. But at the same time, the walls that we are building are different. So we can advocate on the streets for refugees to be taken into countries, but we don't want them into our homes. Things like that. That we need to kind of find that, I think, congruence. But I just go back to just acts of kindness. I think, it's just so important. And if we can do that, it would be a much better place.
Um, yeah, these conversations always go fast. I do want to ask you, is there any question that I did not ask you, but I should have asked you?
I think we could just go on if we did. So maybe we should just.
Okay. Then, Sharuna, I really would like to thank you for your willingness to talk to me and for who you are. And you're an extraordinary person, not, you know, only as a colleague, but also, and more importantly, actually as a friend. Although we did not stay into connection, but there was always a connection. And so I really appreciate, yeah, as I said, what you do, and who you are. So really work on yours, or I wish that the intention that you have for this coming year will come true, because I do think it's important that we
Inshallah,
take
as I
care of
say.
ourselves as well.
Yeah.
We can't take good care of others if we cannot take care of ourselves, right? So thank you so much for today, and I will make sure that the listeners will be able to start following your work if they want to by mentioning the link in the podcast notes. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. And I enjoyed this too with you, Maurice. And thank you for the really good work you're doing. And lots of strength and peace to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.